Over the past couple of weeks, many of you have let me know that you love hearing stories from my time spent in the Philippines. I was a rooster. He's not very happy. I just took some eggs. The culture was so different from Western culture, especially American culture. The climate was so much different. As you can see, we have beautiful deciduous trees here. Still don't have their leaves back yet from having lost them over the winter. Whereas there it was tropical. A lot of similarities, but there were very drastic differences. So when I was getting the eggs down there today from the hen house, I looked at my watch to see how far behind I was on the things I like to get done in the morning because I slept until 6. And I saw the date. Today is April Fool's Day as of this recording, okay? And it reminded me of an amazing story from my time in the Philippines that I'm going to share with you today. Now, I've got to fess up here up front and let you know this isn't my story. This is the story from a gentleman, an Englishman, who was my best friend while I lived in the Philippines, a man named Ray, who at the time was in his early 70s. Ray is still alive. He's still doing well. He's like over 80 now, still kicking, because he's sucking up the salty air and he's not burdened with first world problems like, oh no, what does that person think of me? Oh no, this needs fixed on the car. The world shall end. He's living in a place where none of that matters, and he's loving life. And at times I ask myself, why did we leave? Well, I know why. What? Another story. So we were coming up on April Fool's Day. We were there in the Philippines. This was probably 8 years ago. My friend Ray and I were sitting on a beach, drinking, throwing back some cold ones. This was one of our favorite places to hang out. This was just a little bit before I got involved with my beautiful bride, Dearly, aka Giggly Girl. This is just before we started dating, and at the time, Ray was single. He would later get involved with a very beautiful woman in her 50s named Letty, who just always she bore, however you say the word, a strong resemblance to Selma Hayek, a woman that I've just always found extremely beautiful. Letty was what in the Philippines they would call mestizo, a lot of Spanish ancestrage in her bloodline, going back to the days of feudalism when Spain for 433 years occupied the Philippines. Anyway, Ray and I are sitting on the beach. It's mid-March, cold here in Central Virginia, certainly too cold to be on the beach, but 7 degrees above the equator there. It was 90 degrees, 90% humidity. We were sweating bullets, having a cold one. And we saw a man walking a giant pig through the surf. And Ray says to me, I've got an idea for you. You're a writer. He said, you guys celebrate April Fool's Day in the U.S. We do in England as well. And he said, where I'm from in England, there's this major newspaper that has a competition. They have a contest where you write a story that isn't true, of course, but it sounds believable. You submit it. He says, I'll give you the idea. You come up with the story, and if we win, we'll split the money. It was like £1,000, which would have been like 1,500 US dollars, which would have been like 75,000 pesos, right? So he starts telling me we should make a story about how in the Philippines, to make bacon, they don't inject the pork with brine after the animal has been slaughtered, but they take the animals for these long walks through the salt water of the sea until they fully absorb the salt through their skin, and then they slaughter the animal, and then they have automatic bacon. I thought it was a good idea. It sounded like something a lot of folks would probably believe if they read. So we were working on that story, and I'd known Ray for a while, and I really liked him. He was a very wise man. Ray, before he retired, he worked in computer software. He was in sales, and he traveled the globe. Though he's from England, lived in England, I can't remember exactly where, but he always referred to himself as a northerner. And he explained to me, and we have a lot of folks from the UK and from England, and I know the difference being around Ray. He didn't want to be called British. He wanted to be called an Englishman because he said he was not from Scotland, Wales, or Ireland. He was from England, and so I learned the difference. So he explained to me how, and this isn't true to everybody, but in the U.S., it's a general consensus that people in the South are more friendly, more laid back and easygoing, and people in the Northeast, at least, are kind of pushy and huffy. And it has to do with the fact that's where the business of the world, the epicenter of the world's business is in Wall Street, New York. So those people don't have time to small talk and hear long, drawn out, winded stories that last 20 minutes long that could be told in two. Down here in the South, we have such time for such things. But I guess in England, it's the opposite. Northerners are considered to be more friendly, more laid back, and the Southerners are the ones that are kind of pushy and all these things. That's how Ray explained it to me. While he's in the middle of telling me this idea he had about this story for brine and pigs, I said, Ray, level with me. Why are you here? Why are you living in the Philippines? Again, he was a successful software salesman that traveled the world. He'd been in more countries than I have states in my own. Well, no, I've been in 46 states. There's 4 I haven't been to yet. He's been all over the world. He explained to me, after he retired. No. It was after he retired. His wife threw him out on his ear, turned his kids against him. So he had 4 adult children. They're about my age, who had nothing to do with him, a mean old nasty ex-wife down the street, in a lot of rain and cold winters. So he said to heck with it. He went back to the Philippines, and that's where he'd been for years when I met him, and he's still there today. He said to me, all I ever wanted to do was sit on the beach and throw back a cold one and not have any stress. He said, I had a particular place in England in mind to do this, and I went there before coming to the Philippines, and it was far enough away from the ex-wife. I didn't have to worry about the kids that hated me because they have nothing to do with me anyway. He said, but I found out this place wasn't quite what I thought it was, and so I've come to the Philippines, and here's where I will remain. And I'm not going back to England because I don't want to be anywhere near that small fishing village. And I said, now, come on, Ray, you can't just throw that out there and not give me the story. Let's put this bacon, so to say, on the back burner. Whatever, I just laughed at my own joke. I'm such a dad. And I asked him to tell me about this village. So Ray had shared with me before, we had a lot in common. He told me he ran cross country in college and track. He was a distance runner, a 10,000 meter guy. He said, I've told you this, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, you'd find it hard to believe that when I was a boy, I was very sickly. I had breathing problems. I had lung problems. He said, my parents didn't know what to do. And again, he's a baby boomer. So no. He's a little bit older than that because he can remember the bombings during the Second World War. He would tell me stories about how he and his family would hide behind furniture and stuff when the Germans would fly over England and just drop their bombs at night. So he's a little bit older than that, but not quite a war, because he was a child during World War II. So he wasn't World War II generation either. He was the one right there between the two. So he explained how the only thing his parents could think of to do, because medical technology was not as advanced back then in the 1940s, as it is now, they had, his father had a sister that had a house by the sea, some small fishing village that was very secluded. It was like in the middle of nowhere. It was actually hard to get to, and the only way you could get to it was by boat. There were roads that would stop at the top of a mountain, and then there were just sheer cliffs down to the small fishing village. So his father, with his mother in agreement, made arrangements to take my friend Ray to stay in this small fishing village when he was about 10 years old until his lungs cleared up. because they were afraid he was just going to expire at some point because he was so sickly, he was so weak. So Ray told me that he ended up spending 3 years total living with his aunt, who was a widower herself, lost her husband in the war, in this village. Now, he said it was beautiful, the people were wonderful, they were very friendly, but they were also very standoffish. They didn't get personal. I'm going to make sure that this breeze coming through doesn't blow my tripod over. They would be friendly and cordial, but they didn't ever want to get personal with anybody. And I can relate to that. That's how I am. A lot of people think I'm so outgoing, I'm so personable, they'd love to be my friend. No, you wouldn't. Trust me. Once you start to get too close, it's just how I am. And I think a lot of folks are like that, and I think a lot of folks that watch these videos are like that, and that's why they kind of get me. So anyway, Ray started hearing stories about this small house that he could see out of the window of the bedroom he stayed in the upstairs of his aunt's house. He had a view looking down towards the ocean, and there was an old stone house down there that was centuries old. Remember, this is England. Stuff goes way back over there. And this house was the first building constructed in this village. It was constructed by the clergyman. He would turn this stone house into a church, which he would use as a home. He would quarry rocks from where the stone house was to build the original buildings in this small town. And as other people came following him, I guess he was I don't want to say a cult leader, but he was a religious group leader. People followed him to this area. They settled it as a fishing village, and now centuries later, it remains a fishing village. But the story goes that the man had vices, namely gambling and drinking, okay? He was an alcoholic, and he soiled the altar. He had built a beautiful stone altar that he had in that building, which served as both a church and his house. But upon that altar, he would gamble and he would drink in excess. So there was a legend in the village that one night he allowed, and they always had candles burning over the altar, so there was always light. But one night, in a drunken stupor, he passed out when the candles were almost at their wit's end. You get it? Like wit's end, okay? So wit's end, they burn out. So while he slept, total darkness filled the building. The altar was shrouded in total darkness, and out of that darkness crawled something sluggish, something malevolent, something that looked like a giant snail that had the mouth of a leech, and it sucked the soul out of this man and everything else. And his body was found the next day by his parishioners, and it literally looked like a bag of bones. Well, Ray's telling me this story, and I'd never heard anything like this before. About this time, these two beautiful Filipino ladies come by the beach and start small talking with us, and they ask us if we would like to join them in a drink over at their place. They were hanging out down the way here. And again, I told you, right? Ray and I were single at the time. Ordinarily, we didn't have to be asked twice in these situations, but I told these lovely ladies, thank you, but no thank you. Well, Ray was getting up. He was ready to go with them. I was like, no, Ray, you are finishing this story. And I told the girls, we'll be down there later. And they said, well, don't expect us to wait. And they took off, and they didn't wait, as we would find out later. And Ray was like, are you crazy? They're beautiful. I'm like, yeah, I am crazy, but you're telling me a hell of a story here I've got to get to the end of. Please continue. So he told me that while he was a boy of 10 to 13 years old living there with his aunt, there was an artist that was living in that original stone building. He was either a musician or a painter. I can't remember which one. And he stayed to himself, very standoffish. Everybody kind of left him alone. But he drank to excess. The guy was a lush. Well, he was an alcoholic, okay? And so everybody in the village always said, that guy's time's coming. Well, Ray, as a child, didn't think this guy's time was coming because he didn't believe in such hocus pocus. He felt the story was just some old urban legend, some old wives' tale. Never put any, he never put any stock in it. So the sea air, the clean living, he became very active while he was there. His breathing condition, his lung problem, cured itself. He didn't have to worry about it anymore. And his aunt wrote to his father, and the parents came and got him, and he went back to wherever he was from, and he grew up, and he would go off to college. He got into distance running in middle school, high school, successful distance runner in college, and then after his graduation, he got into a technology that was so new back then. I mean, computer software back then in the 70s, maybe even the 60s. He was probably in college in the 60s. Yeah, 70s, 80s. And I remember asking him once, I said, okay, you worked in that industry. Did you ever imagine we would get to where we are today with technology? And he said, of course. He says, I'm surprised it took so long. He says, wait until you see where we're going next. This guy had big aspirations for where we're going with technology. I mean, look at it. I'm sitting in my backyard, and this is not like a humble brag. I'm sitting in my backyard telling about a 20 to 25 minute story, and this is my job. I'll spend the rest of my day, I've just separated 2 roosters. I got to work on a chicken pen. I'm going to saw up some logs so I can split them later, cleaning up some brush around the property, and the whole time I'm doing this, I'm going to have my beautiful bride, aka giggly girl, her name's Dearly, with me doing it while our son's here going to school from home, because even though we're in a worldwide pandemic, he's doing virtual learning, so he's not getting left behind as far as his education goes. It's an amazing time to be alive if you understand and you take full advantage of the technology that we have. And my friend Ray told me that it's going to get even better, and I believe it. I absolutely believe it. Okay, so he retired, went back to England. Wife threw him out on his ear. I guess she got one of his pensions. He gets to keep the other. Over there, I guess they get a government pension, and they have really high taxes. And then he had his corporate pension. She got one or the other, whatever. He went back to that village before he went to the Philippines. His aunt's house was still there. It was still in the family, but nobody lived there. So he figured, well, I'll just take up shop at my aunt's house. I can walk down there to the beach, sit on the beach, watch the ocean, throw back a cold one, live happily ever after. So he got there. He gets back to the fishing village, and he'd been there a few days, and he's peering out the window of his old bedroom from when he was a child so many years ago, and he notices there are lights on in the old stone house. Now, it was morning, but the sun had not come up yet, so it was still dark, and there were lights on in this house. And he thought, well, whoever lives down there, and I'm just protecting the tripod here, must be an early riser as well. But a couple nights later, when he got up in the middle of the night to pay the water bill, he happened to glance out the window, and he noticed those lights were still on. So he remembered the story he'd heard, the old superstition in which he didn't believe, and he thought, whoever lives in that house must have heard of this, because the story went, you can never let it grow dark around the altar, or this sluggish type creature with the mouth of a leech will come and suck the soul and everything else out of you as well, because the altar had been desecrated by the original inhabitant of the home, the holy man who was obviously human after all and not so holy, and participated in those vices at the altar. So one day, my friend Ray decided to walk over there, and he met the man living in the house, and it turned out it was the same artist that had lived there when Ray was a child. The guy was in his mid to late 20s when Ray was a child, so he was in his 60s or so around the time this happened, maybe 70s. No, he would have been older than that, because it was after Ray retired. Ray was 60. The man was already up there, 70s or 80s, okay? So Ray told the man who he was. The man actually remembered him, and the man asked if he'd like to join him in a drink. The guy was already drunk. Turns out the artist living in this stone house drank in excess as well regularly. So Ray said he'd join him for a drink. He went into the house and he saw this guy's paintings, and he recognized the general theme of each painting. They were locations or spots or homes or trees there around the village, but it was the backdrop of the paintings that just struck horror into the heart of my friend Ray. There were demonic figures. There were creepy looking creatures, some like this leech that was said to have sucked the soul and everything else out of the original inhabitant of the house. And Ray asked the guy, he says, "What is the meaning of your work here? I don't get it." And the guy said, "I paint what I see." He says, "We all look and we all see that beautiful house, or we see that old tree by the sea, but these other things I see as well." And that's been a topic of discussion here in our videos lately. People who have the eyes to see and the ears to hear that not everybody else does. Well, Ray got scared, but he didn't want to come across as rude, so he stayed with the guy for a while, and he drank with him. And he said when he left, the guy was, well, he was drunk when he met up with him, and he was way drunk when he left. So he left after dark to go home, and the next day, the artist's body was found in total darkness. Candles that had been burned out and had gone out at the altar at some point in the night. The man's remains looked like a bag of skin filled with bones, as if his soul and everything else had been sucked out of him entirely. Ray packed his stuff that day, took the next boat out of the village, and soon thereafter was in the Philippines, living happily ever after. He finished his story, and I looked at him and I said, "Oh my God, you have got to be kidding me." He said, "I am." He said, "I just paraphrased a short story for you written by the great English short story horror writer C.F. Benson, or E.F. Benson, I believe it is. Nothing I told you was true." He said, "Kevin, April Fool's Day." I was pissed. I was like, "Are you serious? Did you see how pretty those girls were?" And he was laughing and laughing and laughing. So anyway, there's your April Fool's Day video prank for the day. The story my friend Ray did tell me, which was a prank on me, because I knew he knew I love stories and he was good at telling them. So anyway, let me show you the eggs I got this morning before I go. I got 4. Yeah. Oh, this one broke in my pocket while I was... Look at that. What a tragedy. As you can tell by the title of the video, the end. Oh, the tragedy of it all.